Welcome to the Toldinstone Podcast. I'm Garrett Ryan, and my guest today is Dr. Deborah Ruscillo, Research Associate in the Department of Anthropology at WashU in St. Louis. Dr. Ruscillo, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Garrett.
Oh, well, likewise. So you specialize in zooarchaeology, using animal remains to shed light on life in the ancient world. To begin with a very general question, how much information can we glean from the bones of an animal that died, say, 2,000 years ago?
If it's 2,000 years ago and it's culturally deposited by humans, that opens up a number of questions that we can extract from this bone deposition. The first basic thing is, what species are we looking at? And by knowing the species, we can determine what kind of relationships humans had with their animal surroundings, what domesticates they had, what hunted species were in the environment. And so knowing the species can tell us a lot about the human habitation, their economy, their diet, but also about the paleo environment around them. We can also tell what part of the body was preserved. Sometimes it's a whole body, and sometimes it's just a part of the body. And depending on the context, that can give us some very good information about what kind of deposit it is, whether it's a kitchen deposit or whether it's a very specific type of ritual. Whether there was preferred parts of the body, whether it's from a tannery where they're removing the skin, for example. So part of the body is also very interesting to know. The sex of the individual, that also tells us like herding strategies. If they're keeping animals for secondary products, for example, without killing them, your dairy products, your wools. Eggs, for example, you can have those products without killing your animals. And if you know that these sheep, for example, are males and they're killed very young, this is probably what's happening, that they're keeping the females for those secondary products, the wool, etc. And so knowing the sex of the animal can also tell us a lot about that as well. The age of death can tell us something about the season in which they were killed. We know that lambs, for example, are born in the spring, mostly. And so knowing the age at death can also tell us something about herding strategy when they start coloring those animals. And so there's much to be told. I think the most important interpretation comes from associating those bones with the context. What else was found with those bones? Is there architecture associated with those? Are there pots? Are there other finds? So looking at the tools and other things that are found with the animal bones will also give us a good interpretation of what those bones are actually doing there.
Oh, well, that's fascinating. I suppose to gleefully mix metaphors, it's one tessera on a mosaic, these bones.
Absolutely.
Wonderful stuff. So to ask a follow-up question, what factors shape the preservation of ancient bones?
Those are taphonomic studies that archaeologists and zooarchaeologists do as well, because there are some situations where bones will preserve much better. For example, if you have dry conditions in a desert, tombs also preserve animal bones much better, whereas say highly acidic soil will degrade those bones, and those more fragile bones like the birds and the fish often will go unrepresented in those samples because the acid in that soil has just ripped through them. So the taphonomic processes are very important when we try to interpret these things. It's not always about what's present, but what isn't present that we have to think about. And so in general, ancient animal bones and those assemblages that we find are crushed into very small pieces, because ancient people knew that the marrow was the most nutritious part. And for some cultures think it's the most delicious part too. And we just chuck those out. And so our bones, if somebody was to look at our garbage in 2,000 years, they would see that our bones are fairly apart from the basic butchering that they do. But if you have a whole leg of lamb, the bones are going to remain intact. Whereas in ancient times, I can only imagine the breaking, and in the Bronze Age, for example, and before that they were just seated at the table with rocks just to break these tough bones open to extract the marrow. And there would be a lot of slurping and sucking out of these bones to get the marrow. But that leaves us a heap of slivers that you have to determine these things, the species and the sex from and
Oh, I mean,
age.
it must be fiendishly complicated. And I'm
Oh,
sure
yeah.
that, too, once they're thrown out, then the animals get them, dogs know on them. I
Hmm.
remember when I was a kid, I would find deer
Rodents.
antlers. Right, that mice have been gnawing at the antlers. You'd find all of these nipple marks or the whole prongs gone because they'd been going for the calcium. Um,
Yeah. And
right.
deers
So,
often eat their own antlers
oh,
too. They
right,
chew on their
exactly.
own antlers, which is why a lot of the times we don't find them. But
Right, yeah. So quite a bit to glean from these things, obviously.
absolutely,
And
yeah.
with so much information at stake, it seems like it was surprisingly late that archaeologists began to even notice bones as part of a site's story. So when did this transformation happen, that bones became artifacts and were accepted as such?
Interestingly enough, back when I was a graduate student and I had a fellowship at the American School of Classical Studies at the Wiener Lab, they asked me to do a catalog of all the animal bones that had been kept from the beginning of excavations, the Corinth excavation. That was
Hmm.
1896. And then do the same in the Athenian Agora since 1931. And I was actually surprised to see that they had kept some animal bones from some of those more important, they determined important deposits that were found with altars or domestic shrines or in a pot, for example. Those things were kept. But back in the turn of the century, before the 30s, they would just get a veterinarian in or some horse doctor or something to say, well, what do we have here? And they'd give you a list of it. And that was kind of the extent of it. You wouldn't have zooarchaeologists. You wouldn't have zooarchaeologists until about the 60s or 70s
Hmm.
when these kinds of inquiries started. And certainly by the 80s and 90s, we start getting zooarchaeology as a career and as a field, a subfield of archaeology.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, you wonder how much was lost, sadly, in those early years, and it was just
Yeah.
bone was bone, and out it went.
Yeah, I mean, all those early excavations of those Tholos tombs in the Bronze Age, I
Right,
mean, they just chucked all the bones out, even the human bones, looking
right.
for all those artifacts when archaeology was part of art history rather than
Hmm.
anthropology.
I remember reading, I think it was one of Schliemann's excavations at Mycenae. He'd uncovered, the grave circle there famously with the masks and all that. And they lifted
Right.
one of the masks and there was still tissue preserved on one of the skulls. But of course, they didn't know what to
Yeah.
do with it. It was the 1880s, so it just rotted and that was the end of it.
Yeah.
A real
Yeah.
tragedy.
A lot of
Um,
information lost, but luckily there's Tholos tombs being found today, and
mhm.
proper analysis. And you can't wait for those studies to come out so that you can see, just get the window into the past of certain circumstances that have been lost in the previous excavations.
Right. So, moving on to one of the many sites you've worked at over the years, could you please describe the Roman villa at Apano Scala in Mytilene? And what can the bones discovered there tell us about the Roman diet or Roman diets?
That was one of the most fun. This is the thing about zooarchaeology. In every context that you're looking at, there's a different story to tell. And every bone that you find is a piece of that puzzle. And so, the Roman period is one of those fun periods to look at because you have this ancient testimonia from these ancient writers that you can refer back to. And when I was studying these bones from the Apano Scala, this was an excavation by Hector Williams from the University of British Columbia through the Canadian Institute in Athens. Um, I was looking at these very strange, it's not your typical sheep and goat. When you look at classical samples, you're usually looking at a pile of these domesticates. But coming out of this dump, this is from a first century Roman villa, and coming from this dump were things like thrushes and songbirds and starlings and lambs and deer, hares and young piglets and mullets and scallops. And the number of taxa that were represented here was really dumbfounding. This was like no other sample that I had ever seen. And it reminded me of the description of the cena of, or the dinner of Trimalchio from the
Hmm.
Satyricon. And that was a satire of the Roman period at the time, of the gluttony. And I've actually published this in Archaeology magazine some time ago, about how important it was that you had this very diverse an interesting menu. And this certainly was representative of that. With Trimalchio, that was a satire. And so he had like, where Encolpius and his friends go to, and they crash this dinner party. And Trimalchio is trying to put on this display, and he doesn't really have thrush, so he's representing them in puff pastry, and he doesn't really have dormice, but so he's making them out of like pork meatballs,
Right.
But this is a satire of things like the cookbook by Apicius, where they have flamingo and braised flamingo and these ostrich eggs and this exotica from North Africa. And it was from, especially the time of Tiberius and Nero, where this decadence in dining was something very social, showing off kind of status thing. And they even talk about how the best cooks were from Cappadocia, for example, so even where your cook was from. But I realized that what we were looking at was not just in cookbooks and not just in satires, but here was the representative of this refuse from these dinners that had a great diversity on the dinner menu. And so that was really fun to look at. And I made the comparison of Trimalchio's dinner to this dump that was found at this Roman villa.
I think of those wonderful unswept floor mosaics you see sometimes. There's all these shells scattered across, an ersatz floor. And it's always a wonderful array of things, from whether it's snails or your discarded bird feathers, whatever else. It must have been a similar assortment, right?
Chicken feet,
of
lobster
course,
tails. And it's not, and when you find the archaeology, there's a definitive proof. This wasn't just, some hearsay. This was actually happening. And we make even satires of it today. We'll remember the scene from The Life of Brian and Monty Python.
Right, yeah.
Where he's selling that in the Colosseum, wolf chips and,
nipple chips,
and jaguar's
exactly.
earlobes and ocelot livers. Yeah.
And it's wonderful stuff.
Yeah, it's great. That was a great sample.
So to move to a slightly more boring sample, I suppose, how do the animal bones and shellfish found at Apanoscala compare with the famous set of remains discovered in the sewers of Herculaneum?
Yeah, that was interesting work. That was published. I think that was Rowan who did that for her dissertation, and followed up by Nicholson. And most of that, while there was a diverse amount of species represented, most of that was seafood that was attained from the shore and the sublittoral shore, near to the shore, where you could go and wade in with up to your knees and pull them off the rock. So there was lots of shellfish, and there was lots of different types of small fish. And so that is more of a domestic setting where you and I would cook at home, and we would get the basic recipe and the basic ingredients that was much more accessible. But when we go out to eat, we expect something that's a little bit more fancy. And I think that's what we're seeing here, is that was more of a day-to-day kind of assemblage from food that was eaten by the average person, whereas the Apanoscala was a little bit more for the paying customer, the discerning customer, the something who had something that was cooked by a professional in the kitchen, something a little more fancy.
Right. I guess eating out as opposed to just eating.
Exactly.
Yeah, honestly, I wish I knew more about the zooarchaeology of Pompeii and Herculaneum in general. It's really not my area of expertise. I know they found so much, often in the 18th century, so it was discarded pretty promptly. But things like in the Macellum on the Forum, they found, I think, fish scales and bones, the drains there. They found, of course, the carbonized fruits. Right.
Oh, yeah. Even bread. How do you find bread?
I mean, I know that wonderful, the bread, the stamped and everything. It's wonderful stuff.
The stamped bread still in the oven. I mean, that volcanic ash really preserved all of that very well. So that's something that you don't find every day for sure. That was frozen in time.
Right. So on the segue of things you don't find every day, in the Athenian Agora, I understand, you hope to identify a large and very strange bone as part of a fin whale skeleton. What was a whalebone doing in the heart of Athens? And what connections might it have had with mythical sea monsters?
Yeah, that was work that I did in the Athenian Agora. John Papadopoulos, who's actually now the director of the Athenian Agora, he came
Oh,
to me with a bone that day. This was back, I think, early 2000s. And this was a bone that was in the display cabinet since 1934 when they excavated it from this K12:2 well from the geometric period. And this well had contained lots of debris of these lower extremities of other animals like equids and bovids, like cattle and donkeys and things, and sheep and goats, just the bottom extremities where you don't find any meat. And then there was this bone, very large. It was cataloged at the time in 1934 before zooarchaeology as an ox blade, shoulder blade, and put in this display cabinet. But John Papadopoulos, he brought this to me and he said, well, doesn't look like a cattle to me. And sure enough, it had very thin cortex and very thick trabecular bone, lighter than it seems, and very typical of these marine mammals. And sure enough, they showed the sample to Richard Sabin at the Natural History Museum in London, where they have 66 different species of whale in there. They have a wonderful sample of animal bones there. He determined that it was from the shoulder blade, yes, but of a fin whale, which is the second largest mammal on Earth. This is not a mammal that occurs, in the Aegean Sea. What on earth is it doing in a well in the geometric period? So this is where you have to look at context. It had cut marks all over it. It had been broken. It had one hole for what we presume to have been a leg, and it was probably used as a working surface for leather. Because of the context with the other lower bones that don't contain meat. This was probably removing of the hides, and then these small cut marks on the surface was from the leather working. And what was it doing there? Well, it was probably washed up on the beach someplace. It was a calf. It was about 3 to 4 years old. And when a calf loses its mother in the big blue sea, it's going to die without mom's milk and then blow up with degenerative gases and then follow the currents. So that was probably how it was brought into the Mediterranean. Now, in Greece, you don't have these huge redwoods or these wide tables that you can make these big butcher blocks from like they have now. This would have been a very tradable item, especially if it had been bashed around the surf as it looked like, defatted, beautiful, big, working, flat surface and soft enough that it won't dull your instruments every time you use it. So this was a very tradable item. So John and I, we did this article together in the AJA about Akitos in early Athens and the archaeology of monsters. And it was fun to look at this because there's so much iconography of sea monsters and different types of monsters by people who really had no clue about natural history. And sea monsters, for example, they might have seen the back of a sperm whale that does come into the Aegean, for example. And then mariners would tell stories about this huge thing they saw in the sea without masks or scuba equipment, not actually having a real look at these monsters, recreate what they think these monsters look like. And so the archaeology of monsters is looking at probably a lot of it are these remains that wash up on the beach that don't look like anything they know. And maybe even paleontological remains of other kinds of animals that they can't explain. We call them monsters. We call them giants. All very interesting. It was also a very fun piece to work on.
Oh, it sounds like it. Speaking of how often inaccurate, or at least creatively, say, interpreted some ancient monsters or ancient animals were, I always think of ancient dolphins, which are so intense looking with those like big fangs. They're very aggressive looking critters.
That article we did, we looked at all the iconography of all the representations. Right. So funny.
And it's sort of, I guess, a stylized version of the dolphin, if nothing else.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned how paleontology was also kind of a factor in how they visualized the ancient world, or the pre-ancient world, rather. And it was hypothesized famously some years ago that the myth of the Cyclopes was inspired by finds of prehistoric elephant skulls. first of all, what's your thought on that? And more generally, how else might fossils have shaped Greek myth?
So, if anybody has seen the skull of a mastodon or a mammoth or an elephant, the first thing that you'll notice is this big sinus cavity that they have for the proboscis. Being ancient people, they would have never seen a skull like this. Otherwise, it looks like, a human skull, because it is a mammal that has a big hole in the center that they might have interpreted as a single eye socket. Because our eyes are facing forward, on a skull that size, they wouldn't imagine that those little holes on the side are the eyes, small eyes proportionately of these elephants. And so finding those in their fields, and they did find all three species in Greece: mastodons, mammoths, and elephants from different periods before human. I guess during Pleistocene, there would have been also human activity there. But certainly the elephants, a lot of them are fossilized. They would have dug them up in their fields and say, what on earth is this? Well, they look like mammals. And so the femur looks like a femur and the humerus looks like a humerus. It must be a giant. And they're just to corroborate their findings and their hypotheses by looking at these huge buildings from the Bronze Age. You're thinking of those big Bronze Age blocks of Mycenae and Nicolae and Tyrins and Gla. They called them Cyclopean because only the Cyclopes could have built those. And this was corroborating those finds in their fields of these giant elephants with these huge skulls with this single eye socket that must only be Cyclops. Adrienne Mayer wrote a book sometimes. I reviewed that book. She called it The First Fossil Hunter, First Fossil Hunters. Yeah, that was a great volume. And she goes looking at those fossil beds that are found in the ancient world and even over the sea there in Anatolia and the Scythians and the steppes, looking at things like protoceratops that have like these big cranial plates that when they're buried, they break off and they look like wings. And they have these beaks like say Triceratops. Everybody has that in their mind, those beaks, and so thus she believes was born these griffins, and they do look like griffins in the ground. And then you see the Scythians with their tattoos that are like griffins. And then out of the Orientalizing period, we start getting these motifs of griffins from the East. And they might very well have been inspired by these paleontological finds. The same with dragons. If you see the predecessors of, say, giraffids, with the horns on their heads, these are pretty ubiquitous around Europe, but they look like dragon heads. And so you can see these mythical beasts and these monsters having been inspired by these random finds of bones in their fields.
Huh. Oh, it's fascinating.
Fascinating.
I think it's maybe it's Krakow Cathedral, but in the Middle Ages they're building a cathedral and they discovered a prehistoric skeleton. They ended up hanging it up as the remains of a dragon, in the cathedral still today. I think that's wonderful.
Fascinating. And they would find these elephant bones and say, "Oh my God, we've disturbed this hero's burial. We must rebury it with all of these fancy fanfare and pompous ceremonies to celebrate these heroes," because they believe those heroes in the Bronze Age were giants.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like the bones of Theseus they discovered, on an island and brought to Athens. You wonder if it actually was a person they found or just, a prehistoric mammoth or something.
They said it was giant, so who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah.
So continuing on, in a similar vein, at a late Mycenaean site in northern Greece, huge numbers of seashells were found mixed in with cremated human remains, hundreds of feet, though, above sea level. How might the Iliad explain the presence of those shells so high above the sea?
That was another very interesting. That's what's fun about zooarchaeological samples, is that you can never know what they're going to show you. But this was very perplexing. I do marine remains as well, so they give me the shells. And this was another excavation by Alexander Campidoglou and John Papadopoulos from the Australian Institute in Athens up in Toroni. And this was a early Iron Age, final Mycenaean site, where they had on top of this terrace these early Bronze Age Age, late Mycenaean pots, and in them were cremated remains inside. Inside the pots as well, though, were these beach pebbles, black beach pebbles, with this water-worn material, water-worn shells, these columbella shells, and dove shells, in common language. And it was clear when they gave these samples, they took out the human remains, they gave them to Jonathan Musgrave, and they gave me the beach material, and were what is this beach material doing in these pots with these cremated remains? These are not offerings, This is not like a full shells that they're ornate and let's give it. These were water worn. These were collected dead, and the pebbles. What on earth? And then I remember reading in the Iliad, book 23. It's the funeral of Patroclus. And Achilles, as you remember, was distraught at the death of his friend. They were going to build him the biggest funeral pyre that they possibly can. And they go about describing during the funeral of Patroclus how they are cutting down these trees. They're tying them up to their horses, and they're hauling them where? They're hauling them down to the shore. Mm-hmm. And it makes good sense, because if you're going to build a pyre that's, 20 foot high or 10 foot high or 20 foot high, whatever, and throw all these slaves in there, and you're going to throw all the pithoi with this wine in there, you're going to throw these their horses in there and their dogs, they're going to slay all these things and throw them in the pyre. This is not something you want to do up in the forested areas where it's going to or it's going to catch the whole forest on fire and cause a wildfire that you can't put out. They're going to put this on the shore. And they describe that very clearly. What was fun about Toroni was, and that's the site, was that on this peninsula, just below where this terrace burials were, to the north was a very fine golden beach, very fine gravel. And to the south was these black pebbles beaches with these water-worn shells. So even from that material, I can tell you that those pyres were made on the south shores with those material, that black pebble material with those water-worn shells. Then when the pyre collapses and you may have to put out the carbon, with the water from the shore, you're going to crush up all of those bones in order to fit into those small pots. And with that, when you collect them, you're going to collect beach material and those water-worn shells. And then you're going to, and it says it very clearly in the funeral of Patroclus, then they're going to put them in the pot and they're going to bury it up in the hill. And so that was fascinating. Again, one of those cases where it's not just hearsay or testimonial or Thucydides just thinking, or rather Homer just thinking off the top of his head. These were actually observed and maybe passed along oral traditions that were cultural and can be attested archaeologically.
That really is fascinating. Like I said, seeing a moment, 35 centuries ago, or whatever it might have been, and having that encapsulated in these, handful of crushed bones and shells. That really is wonderful stuff.
Yeah, and it wasn't just one, This is what they did in the area. Let's take it down to the Pebble Beach and let's set up this big pyre. Let's burn it and crush these bones, put them in a pot and bury them. Quite remarkable.
Oh, very much. So moving to yet another site, I understand you found evidence for an ancient ritual at a sanctuary of Demeter in Mytilene. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that was a very difficult excavation because it was on the Acropolis of Mytilene and on the island of Lesbos. Another excavation by Hector Williams from British Columbia. And that was very difficult because you had a archaic sanctuary, and then you had classical remains over that. And then built on top of that was a Roman, fortress. And then on top of that, you had Ottoman remains. And so everything was always totaled and then rebuilt, total rebuilt. And then at the very bottom of this was scant remains of this sacrificial altar. We know it's Demeter. We have some of these lead tablets that had these inscriptions on them, ceiling tiles that had inscriptions on them devoted to Demeter. And so these sacrificial pits were filled with the tiniest fetal piglet bones. So tiny were they that you could tell that they were pre-birth. And there were so many of them in this semicircular pit and it was just exclusively these tiny piglets, hundreds of them in this semicircular pit, that it was fairly clear that it was from this ritual thesmophoria that this cult of Demeter would have had these celebrations in the fall during the sowing season of the winter wheat, October, November, where they would sacrifice all of these piglets to snakes. And then these putrid remains would be retrieved from the snakes. And somehow these were all very secretive, like the Lucinian mysteries. They're all very secretive. So we don't exactly know all of the details, just a few accounts here and there, the Demosthenes, Lucian, where they would bring up these piglet remains that were putrefied, in a few days, and then mix them with seeds on the altar, and they would be burnt there. And so it was fascinating to find this ritual that was a secret, and yet here are the bone remains from what looks very much like this thesmophoria that we know and we've been studying about, that it actually happened.
Huh. Yeah, it really is wonderful stuff. I remember reading that everyone at Eleusis, every initiate had a piglet, right? They had to wash in the sea with it and then carry it with them over to the sanctuary. I know they did have a ritual way of disposing of the remains of piglets as well, but I guess the symbolism makes sense, but it must have been pretty aromatic when they were doing that sacrifice.
And the putrefaction, some earlier scholars saying, it must have been down there for a year. They would have been mummified in a year. It would have happened in a few days. And looking at snake behavior, if you make enough fuss, they will throw up. They will regurgitate these animals that they've eaten. And of course, there's a sexual connotation there.
Right.
The fertility of the sow. That's why they're using piglets, because a pig can farrow twice a year, 12 piglets twice a year, as opposed to a lamb where there's one or two from each ewe every spring. Piglets would have been not only cheap, but there's something about the fecundity of a sow that is very fitting for a fertility ritual with snakes. You can understand the imagery there.
Of course, right. Yeah, regeneration. And it's, again, wonderful stuff.
Absolutely.
So, turning at last to an aspect of your research that I find especially interesting, could you briefly explain how royal purple dye was made from Murex shellfish? And how much do ancient literary sources tell us about this process? And how do the Murex shells themselves illuminate it?
This was postdoctoral work that I did some time ago, because excavating, I think a lot of zooarchaeologists and archaeologists were finding all of these broken Murex remains in their excavations. Up to that point, everybody was referring to the same conjecture that had been published, that you need these, thousands of murex to make 1 gram of dye. But it was very difficult for me when I found this at Komos. This is on the southern shore of Crete on the Sea of Libya. It was an excavation, Minoan palace, but then a shipshed site excavated by the Canadian Institute with a permit through the American School of Classical Studies from Joe and Maria Shaw from the University of Toronto. But we had kilos and kilos of this broken murex shells, Bolinus shells in the scientific species. Some of them call them hexaplex, whatever. But they were broken in a very certain way. And I was certain, because of the context again, that they were found in these drainage ditches on this paved floor. This was industrial scale, that they were breaking these, extracting something, and had left the debris out. Very difficult for me to understand and publish it. So I had to do this experimental archaeology, and looking at Pliny and other sources. I baited baskets. I baited these other vessels, these ceramic vessels, and I planted them in Comos, in the bay there, and discovered very quickly that it would have to have been a sheltered area because all the pots were getting broken. Other creatures were stealing my bait. They eat these rotting fish, and so you would bait them like fish, these snails. So I went to nearby Matala, and interestingly, there was tons of murex already out because there's certain fish that the fishermen don't want to take home. And so they would throw those overboard, and the murex would collect there. But I did some experiments, and I sunk my baskets there. You had to put like stones in them. And you have to imagine this was a time where there weren't any masks or snorkels. I was cheating, right? These people would go and hold their breath and collect them in pots, and then by hand all the extra ones that were attracted that didn't make it in, and then bring them home. And there would just be an assembly line of people just cracking them open and extracting this hypoblanchial gland that produces the slime. The fun thing about my experiments there, this was pioneering stuff. Some people had done some chemical analyses, but at this scale, doing the recipes and baiting them and cooking this all up, there were things that you discovered, like how terrible the smell was. I mean, they were feasting on rotting fish. This is going to be really terribly smelly. And my fingers, they got so purple. Well, you open these shells and there was nothing purple in them until the slime themselves, with this itself all over my fingers, were turning my hands this bright purple color. It was remarkable. And going to dinner with the rest of the excavation crew, the study crew actually that year, they looked at my hands and they said, "Boy, you really knew who the slaves were back in the Bronze Age." And, It was like shameful. The village women were like, "Oh my gosh, you can't go around like that." And they were taking me into their houses and pouring chlorine on me and acid on me and trying to get my hands clean. And this was really color safe stuff. I mean, it was remarkable.
Oh, wow.
In the process, I also discovered biblical blue because I, followed Pliny's recipe and everything turned gray. And clearly he didn't make the dye himself. He was just reporting what other people thought they knew. But just dipping it into the mixture of this really putrefied, smelly glands and hanging it up without letting it color fix through its light and oxygen sensitive, this slime. And so if you dipped it right away and did not allow it to fully develop, it turned into blue. And so that was a fun part of the experiment. And a lot of people like in the Techelet Foundation, Jewish scholars have contacted me to try to reconstruct this prayer cross and the special biblical blue that was very important to their culture. Very fascinating things. In the end, you don't need thousands and thousands. For example, I made 6 swatches of cloth. I did linen, cotton, and wool and silk. And I did 6 swatches about 20 by 15 inches with 180 murex. And nice deep purples. Everything from a very light pink to a very deep, dark purple, black purple. And then with the blues from a very light blue to a very dark black navy blue. So the range was remarkable.
Wow. Out of curiosity, how long did the smell persist on the cloth?
It still stinks to this day. It's gone on 20 years. I've washed them and tied. And somebody said to me, and quite correctly, that is why the perfume industry was booming in the ancient period.
Oh, wow. So to turn at last to your most recent site, Eklaina in the southern Peloponnese, how much can zooarchaeology tell us about the long-vanished landscapes and society of Mycenaean Greece at this site?
This is a fascinating site that I'm the assistant director, Michael Cosmopoulos of the University of Missouri in St. Louis, under the auspices of the Archaeological Society of Athens. We got this site back in 1997. And then 1999, we've been digging, we did the surface survey for the first 6 years, and we were bringing students as a field school. So we have a wonderful sample of archaeological bone from this site. And what I think is the most fascinating for me is that there's many species that I do not recognize. Now, after doing this for 30 years, you kind of look at a bone and say, oh, okay, this is sheep. Okay, this is goat.
Mm-hmm.
This is pig. This is cattle. But there is many bones that I do not recognize. And this is an opportunity for me to reconstruct the paleo environment of the southern Messenia. And this is by Pylos. This is at the time of the Trojan War. This is, it's contemporary with all of that. And the Palace of Nestor across Jack Davis and Sherry Stalker that are digging over there now too. So this is all contemporary with all of that. What it is now, it's olive groves. And we have the records from the Turkish period when it was wheat fields. What was it before that? And for example, I found snails that we know the habitat to be thriving underneath a bed of fallen deciduous leaves. Well, there's no deciduous trees in the area anymore. And we can imagine from all of the hunted species that I have so many wild boar and, 2 species of deer at least. I have bear, that this was a very lush forest at some point, where these snails were thriving and these wild species were thriving. But it's what we say about the deforestation of these sites, right? Everybody's using wood to cut down the trees, to build, to heat up their homes, to cook with, and they deforest the whole area around them, which often leads to abandonment of the site. That's not what happened in the case of Iklana, but hostile takeovers and then the Dark Ages. But it's an opportunity to use molecular strategies now. So zooarchaeology has entered into hard science where we're looking at the molecular composition of these bones, even looking at the proteins that we can extract from the bones to determine what species they are. So it's not about me just making up stuff. Oh, it must be this kind. It must be an otter. It must be a badger. It must be, I'm actually using molecular data to reconstruct the paleo environment of this landscape that has been changed by so many different cultures in the past 3,500 years. It's really fascinating.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I can envision hearing these finds, the world of the Homeric heroes, that these dense forests and bears and boars and lions in the mountains. And it's different from the Greece we know, of course, but we can glimpse it at these different scales from molecular to whalebone, for example.
Right.
Dr. Ruscillo, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful interview. I've learned a great deal, and I'm sure everyone listening has as well. Again, thanks so much for your time. And everyone listening, thanks for tuning in.
It was fun to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my great pleasure.